Hello, my name is Doug Mackenzie, and I'm the President and Chief Operating Officer of Mackenzie Images, and I am so proud to be able to be with Don Bonker today, the former Congressman from the state of Washington. And Don has just now come out with a new book called A Higher Calling. And this is it, and I cannot wait to have you all get a copy and enjoy reading it as much as I did. It's a page turner. Cover to cover, it was phenomenal, timely, and so profound. Don, thank you for joining us today.
Well, Doug, thank you for that compliment, and I appreciate this opportunity to chat with you on the book.
Don, your book says it's a memoir. It's so much more. So much. Yeah. Is it something more?
It certainly is. Doug, it started as a memoir. I'm thinking of family legacy. You know, the great-great-grandchildren saying, well, he served in Congress. What was that about? But as I got into the writing, I realized it took on more meaning, maybe a purpose, and I eventually changed the title to A Higher Calling. And the big game changer occurred in Kazakhstan. His name was David Applefield, and he's on the cover of the book. He was a senior person at the Financial Times, but he had a side business that nurtured authors. And he looked at a few chapters, and he committed to helping with all the chapters, and it's made a huge difference. I like to say that my bones, which is the experience, were on the table, and he put the flesh on the bones that made for a more enticing reading.
Yes.
So I really appreciate that. But I also realized there were a select number of senators and congressmen I worked closely with who had a profound influence in my life, both public service and personal. And it was their character, it was their sense of civility, how they would reach out across the aisle to others to achieve a consensus, to get something accomplished. And that is a standout in the book, and that's why I have an appendix called Profiles in Character.
You know, when I read that, it reminded me of John Kennedy's book, Profiles in Courage. How many are featured in your book?
Well, that's where I got the idea. I actually have 10, but it really comes down to 6 that I work closely with in the Congress that are featured.
Can you give me one example?
Well, they were both Democrats and Republicans, but I'll select a Republican. His name was Mark Hatfield, Oregon governor, US senator, but it's the scene in San Francisco at the 1972 Republican convention. And Mark Hatfield was a rising star in the Republican Party.
Yes.
He was a keynote speaker, and he was Richard Nixon's preferred choice to be on the ticket, to be vice president.
As vice president, okay.
But Nixon's inner circle, the political operatives, said, no, that can't happen. The biggest issue in this presidential election is Vietnam. And Mark Hatfield's view is more closely aligned with the Democrats, not the Republicans. That would be a horrible thing to happen. Nixon said, go persuade him to change his position. And so they met with Hatfield and said, you can be on that ticket. Reverse your position on Vietnam. And he said, I can't do it. And he didn't. Not only was he not on the ticket, he could have been vice president and ultimately president. So that's quite an example of conviction ahead of political ambition.
Excellent. Don, you've been in politics for 22 plus years. How did you get started?
Well, it's amusing that I say it started at a fist fight, a get acquainted dance in college, my first week in college. It was over the kind of music they were playing, actually. And so the following Monday, we had to appear before the dean of students. The other guy was put on probation because he had been drinking. And the dean then turned to me and he said, young man, you want to change the music around here? You march across that hallway, get involved in student government. That's how we get things done. Then it was a year and a half later, I decided to run for a county position in the courthouse. First step, go meet the county chairman, announce your intention, which I did, and he wasn't terribly pleased and informed me that he had his own candidate for that job, and I should wait for my turn later on. And I was naive, and I persisted, and finally he cut me off and he said, "Young man, if you run for this position against my candidate, your career is over before it begins." Then, 8 years later, it was Congress, and I got into a hotly contested primary with the two most powerful senators in the state legislature were my opponents. One was head of the majority leader, the other was head of the caucus. No way could I have won that election. The odds were insurmountable, but I won. When I look back over my 22 years in elective office, sure, I won a few I shouldn't have won, but I also lost a few that I should have won. And they were for the US Senate.
Understand. When you were elected first year, it was 1974, and that was the Watergate year, if I remember right. Did that make a big difference?
Now, Watergate triggered a political tsunami that swept across America's heartland and ushered in the election of 79 of us, young Democrats, and boy, we came to Washington with an agenda, reforms. But Nixon was gone, not directed there. We didn't necessarily want to go on the attack to Republicans. It was our own Democratic leadership in the House. And it was actually the seniority system. In those days, those committee chairmen were called the committee barons. They acted like authoritarian rulers and sometimes would not take up the kind of issues that got us elected. So we directed our efforts against the committee system. And eventually we voted out 4 of those committee chairmen. We changed the rules. And the bottom line is we made a big difference when the Watergate babies came to Washington, D.C.
I totally could appreciate that. As a newly elected congressman, tell me a little bit about what you felt and how it feels to you to take that oath of office. Was it a game changer for you?
Well, I have a chapter there called Littered with Unknowns, because in that early experience, it was a lot more than just being in the House chamber, strolling around the U.S. Capitol, in the committee rooms, votes, and the issues, and so forth. It was a lot more. And we find that the personal experience is just as important as your official duties as a U.S. Congressman.
Understood. You have a chapter that I enjoyed reading, and it goes along with your original title, which was Dancing to the Capitol. It's called Foxtrot on the House Floor. Explain that to me.
Well, I should have had the title Cha-Cha-Cha the way it worked out. But amazingly, I think we were in Congress just 3 months, and a scheduled vote was on increasing our salaries. Well, at the outset, no way am I going to vote for a salary increase. But I was curious, and I wandered over to the House chamber. It was empty, except for the officers there, and so I sat down, and it's a 15-minute vote, and I'm watching the first 5 minutes, overwhelmingly in favor of voting a salary increase. And then suddenly, this congressman appears and sits down right in front of me. Well, it was Tom Foley, who was who was part of the congressional leadership. He was our dean, powerful guy.
Yes.
He's seated in front of me. And then I was watching the second 5 minutes as the...
You only have 15 minutes, correct?
Only 15. It was getting closer. And he turned and said, "Don, we need your vote." And suddenly I realized
The
I set
pressure was
myself
on.
up. Well, I shouldn't have come over there. That's why my colleagues came in, quickly voted, and left.
Okay.
But I was foolish enough to sit there and set myself up to feel the pressure. And the vote was getting closer and closer. And one more time he said, "Don, we need your vote." And I started to realize it was not just a vote for my salary increase, but his salary increase.
Certainly.
The other congressional leaders, the two US senators from Washington who chaired important committees, they deserved a salary increase. And this was a terrible situation. It got down to the last few seconds. It could have gone either way.
Well, you know what my question is. How did you vote?
I think you ought to check the records. I forgot.
Very, very convenient and excellent answer. I totally appreciate that. Don, the subtitle to your book is Faith and Politics in the Public Square. Interestingly, you're both a Democrat and a Christian, person of faith. How did that play out for you?
Well, the wake-up call goes back to 1971. I was a candidate for a statewide office, actually for Secretary of State. Carolyn and I traveled to Seattle, and it was a faith-based organization where I gave a talk. And during the question and answer period, this fellow stood up and he said, "Mr. Bonker, how is it you can be both a Democrat and a Christian?" I can't remember my response at the time, but I should have reminded him that Jesus rode into Bethlehem on a donkey, not an elephant. But really, we're talking about two very delicate issues, religion and politics. And it can be contentious if you bring those two issues together. And it's why, and when you look at it, religion, you have moral values that are embedded in the faith, and they're kind of absolutes. And politics is the art of compromise. So the question is, how do you compromise absolutes? And that's why our founding fathers wisely put the so-called separation clause into the First Amendment of the Constitution. And then we've had over the years Supreme Court rulings that have tried to give it more definition, but it remains to be a contentious issue. Now, I've had to experience it in a more personal way as a member of Congress with that spotlight on you all the time.
Yes.
And for my supporters on the left, they were very skeptical. He's a Christian. Does that mean he's part of that moral majority movement? Does he embrace the social agenda? And then for the evangelicals, they hardly ever would endorse or support a Democrat, despite whether he had a deep faith. In fact, what stands out is Jimmy Carter. When he served as president, his deep faith was just public knowledge. Everybody knew, probably more than anyone in the White House, he was a deep believer. And yet, when he came up for re-election in 1976, the moral majority endorsed his opponent, Ronald Reagan. And it went beyond that. Jerry Falwell was head of a PAC that put $10 million in attack ads on Jimmy Carter in those so-called Bible Belt states.
Yes.
It was very contentious then. It's probably more contentious today.
In your book, Don, the theme, it's about character, moral leadership, and a higher calling. Given today's political culture, it seems those are lacking. Today it's more about lying, deception, combativeness, whatever it takes to gain a political advantage. So what would you tell young people today? You had a group of them and you were having a chance to just have an open chat, as they call it, the town hall today. What would you tell them about what it takes to hold that higher calling in politics today?
Well, that's a very good question, Doug. It really starts at the outset. What defines who you are as a person, even before you enter the public sector? Do you have a set of principles, something of a moral compass that can guide you through all the difficult terrain, politically dealing with conflicting interests and so forth? Or lacking that, are you vulnerable to those powerful political forces that are out there? The lobbyists, the special interests, the campaign funders, and let me tell you, they are very powerful in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
Is that these forces are going to shape who you are, how you will serve. And ultimately, that's how you're going to be perceived and how you will be remembered. And that's why I hope my book will bring some value to those who might enter public life, that there's a way of holding your head high and being committed to doing what's right for the nation and for yourselves.
Don, I want to thank you. This is a book that is coming out at probably one of the most opportune times. I would highly recommend it for everyone to read and to get an insight into your experience. This is not just something that you read on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
This is your experience.
Yes.
It is indeed a memoir, but it touches all the bases, and especially for a higher calling.